Picture this. You're the new Home Secretary. You've been in the job for literally 5 minutes. Your predecessor just resigned over a stamp duty scandal. The Prime Minister who appointed you has approval ratings somewhere between a root canal and food poisoning. And your first major policy announcement is that you're going to get tough on countries that won't take back migrants by threatening to restrict their visas. Sounds firm, sounds decisive, sounds like you mean business. Except according to Freddy Gray from the Spectator, after a while, all this no-nonsense talk just becomes nonsense. And honestly, when you look at Labour's track record on immigration, he might have a point. Welcome to the Shabana Mahmood era, where tough rhetoric meets impossible reality and everyone's already betting on how long she'll last. Welcome back to UK Political Insight, where we dissect Westminster's greatest hits and most spectacular failures, often within the same 24-hour news cycle. And boy, do we have a story today. Shabana Mahmood is the new Home Secretary after Angela Rayner's resignation triggered a cabinet reshuffle that nobody saw coming. Rayner admitted she hadn't paid enough stamp duty on a house in Hove, which is the kind of financial irregularity that ends careers faster than you can say expenses scandal. So Keir shuffled the deck, moved Shabana from Lord Chancellor to Home Secretary, kept Rachel Reeves in place as Chancellor despite her budget being torn apart weekly, and essentially hoped everyone would focus on the reshuffle rather than the chaos that caused it. But here's where it gets interesting. Shabana Mahmood is being positioned as a hardliner, a blue Labour social conservative who's going to take control of the police, MI5, and domestic policy and actually solve the migration crisis that's plagued every government for the last decade. Her big policy pitch is threatening to curb visas for workers, students, and visitors from countries that won't take back their own failed asylum seekers and deported criminals. On paper, that sounds tough. It sounds like someone finally taking the gloves off and playing hardball with uncooperative nations. Except Freddy Gray went on GB News and absolutely shredded the entire premise in one devastating sentence. It sounds like hardball, he said, but after a while, the no-nonsense talk itself becomes nonsense. That line cuts deep because it captures something fundamental about British immigration policy over the last several years. Every new Home Secretary arrives with tough rhetoric. They promise crackdowns, deportations, reduced numbers, stronger enforcement. They announce policies that sound firm and decisive, and then reality hits. The courts intervene, international law creates barriers, countries refuse cooperation, the numbers keep rising, and the tough talk turns out to be exactly that, just talk with no substance behind it. Freddy is basically calling out the entire pattern before Shabana's even had a chance to implement anything, which is brutal but probably fair given the track record. Let's talk about what Shabana's actually proposing, because the details matter here. She wants to restrict visas from countries that won't take back their own nationals when Britain deports them. That means if a country refuses to accept failed asylum seekers or criminals being sent back, Britain would retaliate by making it harder for people from that country to come here as workers, students, or visitors. The logic is straightforward. You want access to Britain, you play by our rules. You don't cooperate on deportations, you lose visa privileges. It's transactional diplomacy backed by real consequences. Except there are massive problems with this approach that become obvious the moment you think it through. First, the countries that are least likely to cooperate on taking back deportees are often the same countries where people are desperately fleeing from in the first place. Afghanistan, Syria, Eritrea, these aren't stable democracies with functioning bureaucracies ready to process returnees. They're failed states, authoritarian regimes, or active conflict zones. Threatening to restrict their visas doesn't create leverage because those countries don't care. They're not sending delegations of business travelers or exchange students to Britain anyway. The threat is meaningless. Second, even with countries that do have functioning relationships with Britain, restricting visas creates its own diplomatic and economic problems. Let's say you threaten to restrict visas for Indian nationals because India is slow to process deportations. Well, India is a massive trading partner, a geopolitical ally, and a source of highly skilled workers that Britain desperately needs. You restrict their visas and suddenly you're damaging the economy, harming businesses that rely on Indian workers, and creating diplomatic tensions that spill over into other areas. The cure becomes worse than the disease. Third, implementing this fairly is nearly impossible.
Do you restrict all visas equally? That punishes students and skilled workers for failures of cooperation that have nothing to do with them. Do you only restrict certain categories? Then you're not really creating enough pressure to change behavior. Do you make exceptions for certain countries based on strategic importance? Then the whole policy becomes inconsistent and accusations of double standards emerge immediately. There's no clean way to do this that doesn't create massive collateral damage. And here's the kicker. Britain's already tried versions of this before and it hasn't worked. Previous governments have attempted to use visa policy as leverage on migration cooperation. It rarely succeeds because the countries with the worst cooperation are usually the ones with the least to lose. They're not invested in maintaining good relations with Britain. They've got bigger problems domestically. Threatening them with visa restrictions is like threatening to take away dessert from someone who's starving. It's not the incentive you think it is. Freddy's point about no-nonsense talk becoming nonsense is hitting home now because this is exactly the pattern. Announce tough policy, get headlines about crackdowns, discover implementation is legally or practically impossible, quietly water it down or abandon it, move on to next tough-sounding announcement, repeat indefinitely. We've seen this cycle so many times that experienced political observers can spot it immediately. That's what Freddy's doing. He's not even waiting to see if Shabana can deliver. He's calling it out in advance because the pattern is that predictable. Now, let's zoom out and look at the context Shabana's walking into, because it's genuinely dreadful. Within days of her appointment, channel crossings for the year passed 30,000, setting a new record. That's not a good start. Your first week on the job and you're immediately facing record-breaking numbers of the exact thing you're supposed to be stopping. It sends a message that the situation is out of control, that existing policies aren't working, that the problem's getting worse, not better. And Shabana standing there with her tough rhetoric about visa restrictions while boats are still crossing the channel daily. David Wooding from the Sunday Express described the Home Secretary role as a graveyard for politicians, and he's absolutely right. Think about the recent history. Priti Patel left under clouds of bullying allegations and policy failures. Suella Braverman was sacked after repeatedly clashing with Sunak and failing to reduce numbers. Yvette Cooper lasted barely a year before getting shuffled out after Rayner's resignation created an opening. Nobody succeeds in this job because it's fundamentally impossible given the constraints. You've got legal obligations under international law. You've got courts that intervene to block deportations. You've got countries that won't cooperate. You've got a public demanding results that can't be delivered. It's a no-win situation. Don Nisa made a brilliant point on GB News that solving the migrant crisis is an almost impossible task for Mahmood, specifically because of Keir Starmer. And she's onto something there. Starmer's approach to immigration has been schizophrenic. He wants to look tough to appeal to red wall voters who care about controlled borders, but he's also constrained by the progressive wing of his party that views aggressive deportation policies as cruel and inhumane. He's trying to please everyone and ending up pleasing nobody. That leaves his Home Secretary in an impossible position, expected to deliver tough outcomes with one hand tied behind her back by political considerations. Shabana's background as a blue labor social conservative is interesting in this context. She's positioned as someone from the more traditionalist wing of the party, someone who's comfortable with law and order rhetoric and doesn't shy away from socially conservative positions. That's presumably why Starmer appointed her. He needs someone who can sell tough immigration policies without looking like they're uncomfortable doing it. But being comfortable with the rhetoric doesn't mean you can overcome the structural barriers to actually implementing those policies. Priti Patel was plenty comfortable with tough talk. Suella Braverman practically built her brand on it. Neither of them managed to solve the problem. The deport foreign criminals policy Shabana announced last month sounds good, but runs into similar issues. Yes, deporting criminals after sentencing frees up prison space and protects the public. Nobody's arguing criminals should be allowed to stay. But the same barriers that prevent deportation of failed asylum seekers apply here too. Countries refuse to take people back, court challenges delay removals for years, human rights protections kick in if someone faces danger on return. The policy sounds simple, but implementation is a nightmare of legal and diplomatic obstacles. And this brings us back to Freddy Gray's central point. After a while, the no-nonsense talk becomes nonsense because it's all talk. It's announcements and press releases and tough statements that don't translate into actual results. The public's not stupid. They notice when politicians promise crackdowns and nothing changes. They notice when deportation flights get blocked by last-minute legal challenges. They notice when small boat crossings keep setting records despite years of promises to stop them. The the credibility erodes until even the toughest-sounding rhetoric gets dismissed as meaningless bluster. What's particularly frustrating is there probably are things Britain could do to better manage migration, but they require uncomfortable trade-offs that politicians won't embrace. Want to reduce asylum claims? Process them faster overseas before people reach Britain, but that requires significant diplomatic and logistical infrastructure. Want to increase deportations? Invest heavily in detention facilities and legal processing. Accept that courts will still block many removals, and be prepared for bad optics when things go wrong. Want to reduce irregular crossings? Create more legal routes so people don't resort to boats, but that's politically toxic because it looks like increasing immigration. Every solution has costs and trade-offs. Politicians want solutions that are all upside with no downside, which don't exist, so they announce policies that sound good but fall apart on contact with reality. Then they blame the courts, the opposition, international law, uncooperative countries, anyone except their own unwillingness